Thanks, Mike. I assume I can block my camera anytime?
Yes.
Okay. No one needs to see my face. Listen, thanks very much for the invitation to speak and for an opportunity to share a good story with you. I really appreciate the efforts Mike Mayo's made and the Manitou Heritage Center to follow up with scholars like me. So I have the pleasure to talk to you today a little bit about the first recorded ascent of Pikes Peak, with the emphasis on recorded, of course. Uh, the area has been occupied for at least 12,000 years by Native American tribes, various stripes, so to speak. And there's no question that innumerable peoples over that period made the summit for reasons personal and ceremonial and communal, no doubt. So this is really the Western perspective, Western meaning Western civilization perspective on a written document that brings a lot of detail and clarity to the Euro-American exploration of the West at a pivotal time. So an in-depth article on the subject appears in the summer issue of the Colorado Magazine put out by History Colorado, the state historical organization, and I think that's online. You can track that down for a full narrative. But we'll share some highlights today. We're starting out with a slide of the peak from the prairie at some distance, and you'll notice it's a little out of focus, and I think it's appropriate because I use this slide to give you just a moment to consider 12,000 years of human occupation in this area as revealed by the archaeology. And 12,000 years is beyond most of our ability to really get our arms around. But in any case, Edwin James, whom we'll meet in a moment, was certainly not the first. Now, Euro-Americans arrived in the area when New Mexico was founded in 1598. And over the next 200 years, Spanish traders, hunters, official government explorers, and wartime expeditions ventured north from New Mexico, from the base at Santa Fe, onto the high plains of Colorado. And here we have a map drawn in 1779 by Mira y Pacheco after the Anza expedition. And if you look in the upper right, near just to the left of the word norte for north, you'll see a mountain range and a illegible notation that says Sierra del Almagre. And of course, you may know that Almagre Mountain is a name that still pertains to the summit south of Pikes Peak, but that was a name that was applied by the Spaniards for several hundred years to the Pikes Peak Massif. The Spaniards were intent initially on fabled riches, thinking that the conquest of Mexico and Peru would be replicated here in the interior of North America. And of course, they missed a lot of the gold that in fact was here. But they were not interested in mountain climbing. They would be interested in mountain passes and river valley trails, and would have used millennia-old buffalo trails that were in turn used for centuries by Native Americans. But mountain climbing was not a thing at the time. So brings us right up to the young United States looking west instead of north. So for the Ute, for instance, this is the center of the universe where they were coming to the world. For the Spaniards, our region was the north, the unknown north. For the Americans in the late in the stages, it was the west. So in 1820, in the wake of Lewis and Clark and the purchase of Louisiana and a dispute with Spain over the boundary between New Mexico and the Louisiana Purchase, the Secretary of War directed Stephen Long, Major Stephen Long, whom you see here, to follow the Platte River to the Rockies and explore the sources of the Platte and Arkansas rivers, ostensibly for geographic knowledge, but of course also to explore any economic possibilities. And if you could exploit economic possibilities, you could move ahead your political claims. So Long set forth with an unfunded expedition with promises of funds upon his return from an encampment on the Missouri River in June 1820. Along with him was a 22-year-old Vermonter named Edwin James, who had been educated at Middlebury College and had been tutored in botany and geology and medicine by some of the leading men of the day. Now, James published on Long's behalf a two-volume, almost unreadable treatise on the expedition in 1823 that was compiled from various expedition members' notes, but James himself kept a diary which remains unpublished. It was an expedition, because it was funded by the expedition, it was a government document, but so James was actually careful to hedge his inner thoughts and emotions in his diary, which I visited some 30 years ago at the Columbia University Rare Manuscript Collection, and afterwards obtained copies of major portions of it, which I transcribed over the years, and then tried to use clues to figure out sort of which way James went on the mountain. The route is not as necessarily important as his botanical discoveries and the first descriptions of alpine flora in North America. In addition, Yale University purchased 90 personal letters by Edwin James to his brother, written before, during, and after the expedition. And those unpublished letters also opened a real window onto the personal dynamics of the expedition, namely the contentious relationship between James and Long. So all things started out rosy on this expedition. They met in Philadelphia in March. I'll let you read this, and then I'll make a point or two. So here in a nutshell is a window onto James's personality. He finds Long has the appearance of a pretty clever fellow of moderate talents. So a compliment coupled with a dig. And then I believe he's formed a pretty good opinion of me, as to be sure he ought to do. So James is doing well in the self-regard department, and it reflects his the dual nature of his relationship with the expedition leader. Now, as to the origin of the climb, you and I both know that Zebulon Pike tried and failed to climb the peak in November 1806 and ended up on a wooded foothill somewhere to the southeast. That's a whole nother story. But Pike issued a report and a map, and on the map, which we'll take a look at in a minute, there was a ridiculously exaggerated mountain referred to on the map as the highest peak. And a gentleman named John Mellish, who was the leading map maker of the day, included that image, as map makers were serial plagiarists, to create an 1816 map of the US that was at the time the most complete. So here we have a letter from James to his brother. Go ahead and read it, and I'll make a point or two. So, not far from the source of the Arkansas, a peak thought to be the highest in the neighborhood. It is our intention to ascend this or whatever other mountain we find to be the highest. Well, Major Long had not yet broached to Edwin James that he planned to make this expedition short and sweet. He'd received no funding. There were 22 men in his outfit, which, venturing across the high plains of Colorado, would have been easy picking for any small warrior band of any tribe in the West at the time. And James, the youthful enthusiasm over seeing this giant peak depicted in the line of march, I believe, suggested the climb, and Long probably acquiesced verbally just to quiet the lad down. And James mistakenly believes now that it is our intention, in other words, an expedition goal, to climb the peak. This is a photograph of the letter we just quoted. And if you look at the third line, he's talking about the Rocky Mountains are the highest part of the continent. And if you look at Mellish's map, you'll see not far from the source of the Arkansas, a peak thought to be the highest. The handwriting is methodical, neat, and clear, yet it's full of early 19th century syntax and penmanship flourishes that a single word could stymie you for a year or two, unfortunately. But this is the one of the documents I worked with. So here's Mellish's map of the United States in 1816. And we are about to look at a close-up. You see the first states on the East Coast. You see the green dividing line of the Mississippi River in the center of the image. And here's a close-up here's the Platte River that Long's expedition ascended. And here is the highest peak, where entire mountain ranges are the highest peak is depicted as something like 5 or 6 times the size of neighboring mountains. So an inferred compliment to our friend Pikes Peak. And here is a glance at the actual graphic that Pike himself had put on his map. And I think you can see that a 22-year-old botanist might get pretty excited upon laying eyes on that. Now, here, the day before departure, Long is informed that the expedition that they're going to make short work of this. I'll let you read that and I'll make a point. So James now knows that Long plans on a swift expedition. Long had the concerns of the lives of his men on his mind. He had not been funded, but only promised funds. And considering the grandiose expeditions he had proposed prior to this expedition, he was anxious to return for something more ambitious. And in fact, James's fear that they would be back at civilization by October turned out to be prescient. So swiftly, the line of march, a camp known as Engineer Cantonment, was the winter camp from the prior year. And on June 6th, Long led his men up the Platte River through 3 successive Pawnee Indian villages on his way to the Rocky Mountains and the sources of the Platte in Arkansas. This map depicts contemporary territories in place at the time, and the division between New Spain on the left and aspects of the Louisiana Purchase, Missouri and Arkansas territory on the right is an approximation and was a point of argument between Spain and the US. This is the same map with modern day states exhibited, and you can see that in modern day terms, they ascended the Platte through across the state of Nebraska into Colorado, along the Platte, coming down by Sterling and hitting the Front Range near Long's Peak, heading south to Pikes Peak, and then descending the Arkansas, splitting in 2, and then the expedition in 2 groups returned to Fort Smith. That's the overview. On the way up the Platte, I said Long had parlayed with 3 encampments of Pawnee, each of which warned him that his little band would be decimated if any native band chose to do so. And I think long had a grasp that this was true. So they ascended the Platte, reached the Rocky Mountains in view of Long's Peak, and at first mistaking it for their goal of Pikes Peak, but on a rise could see the 70 miles south to Pikes Peak, and they headed south. Now, along the way, James's charge was to describe the geology and make botanical collections. He returned with about 700 plant species, and this slide is rather amazing. Around the location of the present-day U.S. Air Force Academy, James encountered and described for the first time scientifically the Colorado blue columbine, Aquilegia caerulea James. And this set of dried flowers are the very specimens James collected 200 years ago this summer that's now in the New York Botanical Garden collection, along with hundreds of others specimens that James returned from the West with. So I find this rather fascinating that here we see the very columbine that James picked 200 years ago. Of course, now he'd be heavily fined for picking flowers, but be that as it may. Well, we need to move along, and here we are now in a diary entry for July 12th, 1820. I'll let you read this, and then I'll make a point or two. Well, seeing that James had already referred to the mountain ranges here as the Rocky Mountains, it's a little odd for him to make a reference to the northern Andes, but be that as it may, he is writing in his diary, and so the second paragraph here, the second quote, is illustrative of the restraint that James exhibited in his diary, which was a government document. And if Major Long had demanded to see his diary at any time, James would have been obliged to turn it over. So here is the diplomatic language. It is certainly to be regretted that we are not allowed a longer time to admire a great phrase, these glorious palaces of nature. And in a uncharacteristic moment of maturity, the 22-year-old botanist says, so it is, and so let it be. However, let's flip to a personal letter to his brother a month after the expedition has returned to settled country. I'll let you read this, and I'll make a point or two here. Feel free to gasp. Well, dripping with sarcasm, James writes, our scientific and enthusiastic commander encamps on a plain of sand 24 miles from the mountains and allows me 3 days to make an examination. I remonstrated, requesting a longer time, but no more could be allowed me. On the evening of July 12th, around the campfire with all 22 men in attendance, Long lets James know, you got 3 days if you want to climb that thing, and then we're off. James remonstrated. He made a verbal protest, with a hint of outrage that he couldn't have longer. A 22-year-old civilian botanist upbraids a 35-year-old commanding officer in front of his soldiers and fellow officers. That's probably why no other scientists joined James on the climb, and you can understand why. Well, along with the expedition were two artists, Samuel Seymour, who was a painter of note, and Titian Peale, the son of Charles Wilson Peale, the famed Philadelphia portraitist. Samuel Seymour rendered this view of Pikes Peak. It's called Pikes Peak in the Rain. And here you have just a few elements. In fact, let me interject that this is, in fact, the paintings by Samuel Seymour and by Titian Peale represent the very origin of what we refer to as Western art, meaning Western United States, meaning Euro-American art, not to be confused with thousands of years of pictographs and petroglyphs whose purpose we no longer fully discern. But here you have a pretty good rendering of a snow-capped peak with some notion of the summit topography, a well-rendered gentle foothills, a cottonwood on the left, and then probably added later what looks almost like rhododendrons from the east, a fanciful element for artistic purposes that bore no relation to reality. And you have the classic Western sky, where you see a storm in only one area of the sky, and in the other areas, it's completely clear. One of my favorite paintings from any era, really. Okay, so in the 90s, among other adventures I was involved in, I decided that I would try to retrace the James Ascent using clues in his diary, as well as the identification of various botanical specimens that he collected on the peak. About 30 specimens he collected on the peak. So I started up, well, I went the easy way, which is walking the tracks from Manitou Springs. If you walk from railroad tie to railroad tie, you're in excellent shape. James had a much harder time because he actually had to clamber up in the base of the rocky Ruxton Creek. And the tan material that you see here is your favorite Pikes Peak granite, which in this area disintegrates into sort of marble-sized chunks. And it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I wanted to illustrate that, and so I climbed up Bar Trail far enough to get this perspective. Well, let's join James on the climb. This is the second day of the climb. On the first day, July 12th, he's ridden to the base of the peak, and a couple of soldiers watch the horses while James and the baggage master and a wagon master ascended Ruxton Creek. They started at 3 p.m. Feel free to wince at that start. And by dark, maybe 7, 8 o'clock in the wooded ravine, they laid down to rest uncomfortably. On the 13th, they began climbing, and it would have been the 14th when they achieved the summit. Now, this excerpt from the diary I'll let you read, and then I'll make a point or two. Well, I hope you've had a chance. 2 things about this diary entry. First, the classic greenhorn misperception of distance or underestimate of effort needed to get to the top of a 14er. They set off at an early hour, hoped to arrive on the summit by noon. Not going to happen. Then some clues about the route. The same rugged and difficult road was a reference to the Ruxton Creek, and they, quote, passed a ravine discharging into the small stream, Ruxton Creek, which we had been ascending. And following the dividing ridge between 2 branches of this, we found the way less difficult and dangerous. I think that the route remains in question in my mind. I made several climbs in the 90s directly from Manitou to the summit, one-way climbs because they required all day to bushwhack. And there's a question about whether James's route approximated the cog railway track, which I think he did at times, at the base up Ruxton Creek, as well as the shoulder of Satchet Mountain to the summit. But I think that this clue here, we passed a ravine. Passed in our parlance usually means, went by, but in James's other writings, passed means threaded. So I think there's some further exploring to do around the Lions Creek area that might yield an equally convincing route as the Cog Railway route itself. Well, either way, you would end up at the crater, and this is just a photograph of the lake at the base of the crater at the southeast base of the summit of Pikes Peak. I reached this with great difficulty, at times crawling on hands and knees through particularly thick underbrush, and it was quite a job. Now, as you ascend the southeast shoulder of Pikes Peak, known as Satchet Mountain, there are extensive fields of grass and wildflowers. And I think this is probably one of the more fruitful areas where James would have collected some of his 30 botanical specimens of alpine flora. This is a shot looking back down towards the craters, the pond at the base of the crater on your lower left, with a hiker in red for perspective. And the green sward here is the most fruitful area for the alpine wildflowers, in contrast to, say, the highly rocky Pikes Peak granite that you see in the background. And of course, back under the clouds, Ruxton Creek disappearing under the clouds. Well, I just brought 4 photographs of alpine flora for your enjoyment. The yellow flower is an alpine avens, also known as sky pilot. This is the alpine yellow paintbrush. I should have put a Swiss Army knife in the photo for perspective, but as you know, alpine flora is an inch or 2 high. It didn't grow any taller in that environment, and this flower would be on maybe a stem of 2 inches tall. A sheltered area gives this alpine primrose a place to grow safely. And here we have moss campion growing out of a smidge of soil next to a lichen mottled piece of Pikes Peak granite. Now, just want to watch my time here. Okay, well, let's tidy up here. On a good day, the climb is finished and I believe parallels James' route as the Pikes Peak Cog Railway ascends Satchet Mountain. And in the background, I know I'll make a mistake. I hope the gentleman, there's a man named Ken, his last name is escaping me now, who's an expert on this area, but one of the high mountain reservoirs visible on the left. So maybe a half a dozen trips I made up the peak, and not all of them ended in picturesque circumstances. We took some hail and snow one July, and this is an instance where, for certain, although I'm an avid bushwhacker, off-trail guy, when you finish the climb in a snowstorm in July, you're glad to have a trail to follow. So we're on the summit now. You see in the foreground just the detritus on the summit, and then the arrows pointing to the switchbacks of the bar trail that ascends the east face of Pikes Peak. You see the pond at the base of the crater, and I would have come up through the untrailed country to the rim of the crater, thence to the green sward on Satchet Mountain, to the shoulder and on to the summit. Let me point out here that James and his two companions separated, and it was probably down here somewhere between a little north of the crater, in some proximity to what eventually became the Bar Trail. One man named Wilson peeled off there and ascended the mountain, quote, by a different route. And I believe that Wilson made an ascent that approximated Fred Barr, the trail that Fred Barr eventually built up the east face. And that's why I am considering that the notion that James came up Ruxton Creek and made a beeline for the crater may be an error. And it's just as likely that having taken a drainage just to the north of the crater, that the trio split up somewhere here that would give them equal chances at the summit. Wilson on the Bar Trail and James on the Satchet Mountain route. So here, back from the day when digital photography was in its infancy, someone made me a composite photograph that would give you a little bit more perspective on my initial theory of the route. Now, I mentioned Lions Creek earlier, but what I meant to say was Cabin Creek. And that really represents a ravine that empties into Ruxton Creek and is crossed today by an aqueduct. And I think a fruitful day's work would follow Cabin Creek and a dividing ridge between it and the next creek, which may be Lions if I'm remembering correctly, that would get a party of three to a point where one man could come up the Bar Trail and the other men could go up the Satchet Mountain route. Well, back to the letter that James wrote to his brother after the expedition limped into settled country in the fall of 1820. I'll let you read this and then I'll make a couple of points. So once again, here's a personal letter in which James uncorks his real feelings. He's complaining and bitter about Major Long's conduct of the expedition, and the letter has to begin by railing against him. We have traveled near 2,000 miles through unexplored and highly interesting country and returned almost as much strangers to it as before. The letter continues. Please read these quotes and then I'll make a couple of points. Well, after excoriating his commanding officer for his shortcomings, James warms to bragging of his exploits, much like any of us who might have climbed a peak in a storm and lived. Will tell folks around the campfire the next day the heroics. I have seen many strange things. Shivered among the eternal snows in July, which every man has not done. Great writing. And gone hungry for a long time. When the expedition split in two, James Long and a handful of others descended south from the Arkansas River Valley to find the Red River of Texas and descend it. They instead mistakenly descended the Canadian River and ended up far from their goal. And as anyone who's traveled the high plains in a serious, extended manner, say not on highways with modern conveniences, can attest, July, August, September on the high plains can be brutal. And obviously that led to the labeling on Long's map of our region as the Great American Desert. And if you ever try doing a 20-mile hike in summer on the high plains of Colorado, you will commiserate with that characterization. Now, we've had our fun. There was conflict between Long and James. James was 22 years old in the summer of 1820. So we've just seen a snippet of a arrogant young man faulting others, priding himself. But to be fair, Long doesn't seem to have left any personal diary, journal, or letters. And so we think of Long as being sort of stoic and taking a little crap from James, if you will, understanding that the young, impetuous scientist was still maturing to manhood. James went on to do great things, and as a result of an earlier lecture I gave, a professor of history is going to tackle a new James biography and really mine the diary and letters to paint a fuller portrait of a young man who went on to do many great things, including keeping a station on the Underground Railroad for escaped slaves. His niece, after his death, urged preservation of his letters with a cover note. And I'll let you read this if you haven't already. So here we have a niece expressing admiration for her older uncle, Edwin James, and commending him for his scholarship, his courage, and his moral rectitude. So good old Eddie James might have been a bit of a jerk in 1820, but he grew up like some of us do and went on to do great things. So thanks for your time on this. Clearly, we have carved a beeline from the Missouri to the summit of Pikes Peak in order to do a short presentation, but there's great, rich detail from the journey in the Colorado Magazine article I penned this summer. And there's innumerable primary and secondary sources that illuminate a great deal about this expedition. The artwork it produced was amazing, and as I mentioned, was the very first Western American art after the Native American petroglyphs and pictographs. There were other folks on the expedition doing great work, and Long himself is a curious individual who was one of the earliest inventor developers of the steamboat. So many, many stories could be told, and we've just taken a small slice for today. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Mike or Neil. And if people have questions, glad to take a stab at answering them. And I'd be glad to take email inquiries through Mike if you need to know the sources for various parts of my talk. So I'll stop talking, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, Phil, we appreciate this morning's presentation. You know, as I was looking at some of those photos, I relived some of my own hikes on Pikes Peak, and I'm sure we have a few other members of the audience who've also experienced that climb or descent, whichever the case might be. And you know, I think those photos were reminiscent of our personal times on Pikes Peak. Just to remind everybody, Phil is taking questions this morning. And you have two opportunities to express your questions. First is through the chat button located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And the other way you can pose a question is by pressing on the participants button. And at the very bottom of the participants button, you'll see hand raised. And that would be the other way to get our attention that you wish to ask a question. Do we have any questions out there? And while we're waiting for the questions, Phil, tell us a little bit more about the article you published this past year.
Oh, well, thank you. A typical magazine article is 2,000 words, and the editor of the Colorado Magazine, Steve Grinstead, allowed me to twist his arm to get a 5,000-word article into the magazine. And what I really like to call your attention to, you'll see this backwards, but what was beautiful about the opportunity there with the State Historical Society is they work closely with Native American peoples, And there's a sidebar by two scholars in the Ute Nation talking about the long, deep cultural association that the Ute have with Pikes Peak, about how it was regarded as the mountain of the morning kissing the grandfather sky, because it caught the first light of the day from the sunrise. And it made a really nice addition to what otherwise would have been sort of a Johnny-come-lately Euro-American narrative about a written account. So that was really cool, and I think you can access that online. But there's tons of detail in the article. I mean, the expedition took 2 dogs along with them. Neither of them made it back. There were the earliest references to massive moving black hills of buffalo and other natural resources, the earliest description of the gray wolf in written accounts. So lots of detail that spices up and broadens our story.
Okay. All right, we have a question from Heidi. Her question, or his question, could be, did Long ever write how he felt about James, either before, during, or after the expedition?
Well, that is a great question, and I spent considerable time attempting to answer it. I went through the letters sent and received at the War Department in that time and looked at a lot of Long's official correspondence. None of it mentioned James, nor have historians found any personal diaries or journals by Stephen Long. However, you may infer Long's view of James through the post-expedition doings. Captain John Bell was the official diarist for the expedition, but he was not a naturalist. And upon return, Long understood that the work James and the other naturalists had done really was the full achievement, the most significant achievement of the expedition. Long declined to seek the source of the Platte and Arkansas rivers in speeding his men along, for which he had good reason. But in ignoring the essential core of his orders, he had something to fall back on, and that was the botany, geology, and natural history collections that his scientists had made. So after the fact, Long asked James to write the expedition report, and in doing so, flattered James and kept, they say, embrace your enemies, keep your enemies close. Well, Long evidently neutralized James's fury by flattering him with the authorship of the expedition report and invited James to repeat the experience on another Long expedition, which James wrote that he attempted to join but missed due to bad timing. And I think that reflects some ambivalence on James's point. But Long, I think in sort of a mirror image in the lack of evidence for Long's feelings, his actions reveal he understood James's ire, he neutralized it through flattery, and gave James a useful task that would feed James's need for achieving some degree of greatness.
Okay. Well, again, we invite everybody to ask questions. We have a chat button located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And looks like we got a question here from Betty Haney. Was James in the group that tried to go west through the narrow canyon around Morrison, Colorado, but turned back because of the difficult travel? Maybe they didn't pursue that side the side of exploration in the interest of time.
Great question, and the answer is yes. In presenting 30 to 35 minutes of my yammering, I've omitted tons of details. And included in that is that not only did Long pause for 3 days to let James climb Pikes Peak, but there were 3 excursions, one up Clear Creek that you just referenced, one up the Platte Canyon at Waterton Canyon, and one up the Arkansas prior to descending the river to civilization. In all 3 cases, they soon encountered what you'll recognize from your personal visits there is the difficulty of following any major river out of the canyons of the Front Range. They become narrow, impassable, and the sides of Clear Creek, the Platte, and the Arkansas, I mean, the Arkansas eventually leads to Royal Gorge, right? And the Platte River Canyon is pretty rugged, as is Clear Creek. So small excursions were made from the main expedition up Clear Creek, the Platte, and the Arkansas, never made it more than 2 days, and were not allowed the time, but at least, an important point to make, a capper point, was that from the summit of Pikes Peak, James described what they didn't explore on the ground, and that was he could see the headwaters of the Arkansas in South Park, as well as the headwaters of the Platte, also in South Park. And so the other key element that James provided Long was, if not firsthand on the ground knowledge of the sources of the Platte and Arkansas, James provided the linchpin information about the sources of those 2 rivers, which in a manner fulfilled Long's marching orders. So glad you brought that up. I almost missed sort of like the salient point of the talk there.
All right. Any other questions there? Again, questions can be asked by pressing the chat button at the bottom of the screen. And also you can raise your hand on the participants page. Also to remind everyone, this morning's program has been recorded and will be available on the Heritage Center's website at ManitouSpringsHeritageCenter.org. And again, while you're there, look at our bookstore. We got a lot of good gift ideas for the holiday season. If you love history of Manitou like we love history of Manitou, our bookstore is the place to visit at ManitouSpringsHeritageCenter.org. And let's see here. Let's see. Do we have any other questions out there? Neil, do you have anything?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, we like